They said the Castellano estate was a meat grinder. 34 assistants quit in a single month, terrified of the paralyzed monster ruling from his wheelchair. But they didn't know Penelope Gallagher. She had $60 to her name, a hungry son, and zero time for a mob boss's tantrums. The wind coming off Lake Michigan was brutal, slicing through Penelope Gallagher's thin wool coat like a razor. Penelope, Penny to the few people who actually spoke to her, stood at the wrought iron gates of 1450 Lake Shore Drive, shivering. She was a big woman, carrying 250 pounds on a 5'6" frame. For most of her life, her weight had made her invisible to the world, a soft, fat background character in everyone else's story. But today, she needed to be seen. More importantly, she needed to be hired. Back in a damp, poorly heated apartment in Pilsen, her 4-year-old son, Leo, was wearing 2 sweaters and waiting for his mother to bring home groceries. The eviction notice taped to their door burned in Penny's memory. Desperation had driven her to answer a vaguely worded, excessively high-paying classified ad. Personal assistant required for high-net-worth individual, must possess extreme discretion, physical stamina, and a high tolerance for stress. $10,000 per week. Immediate start. The gates buzzed open. Penny adjusted her tote bag and marched up the sprawling, snow-dusted driveway toward the limestone mansion. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The foyer was lined with imported Italian marble and silent men in tailored suits whose jackets bulged suspiciously at the ribs. Penny was ushered into a cold, mahogany-paneled antechamber by a man who introduced himself as Lorenzo Bianchi. Lorenzo was sharp-eyed, with salt and pepper hair and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He looked Penny up and down, his gaze lingering not with judgment about her size, but with a clinical assessment of her durability. "You're the 9th applicant this week, Miss Gallagher," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The last one, a former trauma nurse named Harper Jenkins, lasted exactly 4 hours. She left in tears." "I don't cry easily, Mr. Bianchi," Penny said, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "And I need the money. I'm not leaving." Lorenzo sighed, a sound heavy with exhaustion. "He is not an easy man. Dominic Castellano was active. 6 months ago, a bullet shattered his T8 vertebra during a business dispute in the Fulton Market District. He is paralyzed from the waist down. The physical adjustment has been hard. The psychological adjustment has been non-existent. He fires people, he throws things, he screams. If you can last 24 hours, you get the first week's pay in cash." "Take me to him," Penny demanded. Lorenzo led her down a dimly lit hallway, stopping before heavy oak double doors. He knocked once and pushed them open, not bothering to step inside. He simply gestured for Penny to enter. The master suite was vast and cloaked in darkness. Heavy velvet drapes blocked out the midday sun. The air smelled of expensive scotch, sterile medical alcohol, and stale bitterness. In the center of the room sat Dominic Castellano. Even confined to a high-tech motorized wheelchair, the man was terrifying. Broad-shouldered and heavily muscled, he wore a dark, unbuttoned Henley that revealed a canvas of tattoos across his chest. His jaw was covered in dark, untamed stubble, and his eyes, a piercing, icy blue, locked onto Penny like a predator spotting a wounded animal. "Get out!" Dominic growled. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Penny stood her ground. "Good morning, Mr. Castellano. I'm Penelope. I'm your new assistant." Dominic's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair. Without a word, he grabbed a heavy crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid from the table beside him and hurled it across the room. It shattered violently against the stone fireplace, mere inches from Penny's thick calves. Shards of glass and scotch exploded over the carpet. "I said," Dominic roared, his face twisting in a mask of pure fury. "Get out! I don't want another pitying, wide-eyed babysitter. Look at you. You won't last 10 minutes in this house." Penny didn't flinch. She slowly blinked, looked at the shattered glass, and then looked back at the feared Mafia Boss. She had survived a physically abusive ex-boyfriend who had abandoned her while she was pregnant. She had survived working triple shifts at a diner while her feet swelled and ached. A rich, angry man throwing glassware was barely a blip on her radar. Without saying a word, Penny walked over to a supply closet she had spotted in the hallway, grabbed a broom and a dustpan, and marched back into the bedroom. She knelt down, a strenuous task, but she managed it with practiced stability, and methodically swept up the broken crystal. Dominic watched her in stunned silence. The heavy, ragged breathing of his anger slowed as he observed the curvy, unapologetic woman cleaning up his mess without a shred of fear or submission in her eyes. Penny stood up, dumping the glass into a nearby wastebasket. She brushed her hands together and looked him dead in the eye. "Are you finished?" she asked, her tone entirely flat. "Because if you are, I need my daily schedule. If you plan on throwing more things, let me know now so I don't put the broom away. But understand this, Mr. Castellano. I have a 4-year-old son who throws better tantrums than you do. You don't scare me. You're just paying me." For a long, tense moment, the room was dead silent. The undisputed king of the Chicago underworld stared at the fat, fiercely stubborn mother standing in his bedroom. Then Dominic let out a sharp, breathless sound. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was close. "Lorenzo!" Dominic barked toward the open door. Lorenzo stepped into the frame, looking mildly surprised that Penny was still upright and uninjured. "Yes, boss. Give her the schedule," Dominic muttered, turning his wheelchair toward the window, hiding his face. "And tell the kitchen I want my coffee." Surviving the first day was a miracle. Surviving the first 3 weeks was a testament to Penny's sheer, unbreakable will. Dominic Castellano did everything in his power to break her. He demanded obscure, impossible tasks. He made her catalog thousands of pages of handwritten, coded financial ledgers. He forced her to wake up at 3 a.m. to reposition his legs, testing if she would complain about the physical labor. She never did. Penny quickly learned the unspoken rules of the Castellano estate. The legitimate business front, real estate and imports, was discussed in the dining room. The actual business, territory disputes, enforcement, and dealing with a rising rival faction led by a sociopath named Victor Moretti, was discussed in the basement. Penny was expected to be a ghost, present enough to manage Dominic's medications, his meals and his correspondence, but deaf to the criminal empire operating around her. Her size, which she had always viewed as a burden in the shallow outside world, became an odd asset here. When she stood between Dominic and an aggressive, argumentative capo who had come to the house, she was an immovable object. Her soft curves and solid frame created a physical barrier that men bred on violence didn't quite know how to aggressively bypass without looking like monsters. More surprisingly, Dominic had developed an uncharacteristic, almost feral protectiveness over her. During her 3rd week, 2 of Dominic's lower-level enforcers were loitering in the kitchen. As Penny squeezed past them to grab Dominic's medication, one of them, a sleazy kid named Tony, made a loud, derogatory comment about her weight, joking that the estate's grocery bills must have doubled. Penny ignored it, her cheeks burning with familiar shame. She had heard it all her life, But she didn't realize Dominic had rolled his chair silently into the hallway. "Tony!" Dominic's voice cracked like a whip. The enforcers froze. Dominic rolled into the kitchen, his eyes black with rage. He pulled a heavy Sig Sauer from his waistband and slammed it onto the granite island. The metallic clack echoed through the massive room. "Pack your things," Dominic said, his voice eerily calm. "You're off the payroll. If I ever see your face in this city again, or if I ever hear a word out of your mouth regarding Penelope, they'll be pulling your teeth out of the Chicago River. Get out!" Penny watched, stunned, as the men scrambled out of the house. Dominic didn't look at her. He just snatched his medication from the counter and rolled away. It was a turning point. Beneath the ruthless exterior of the paralyzed mob boss, Penny saw a man who valued loyalty above all else, a man who respected her resilience. But the fragile equilibrium they had built shattered on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Penny had been granted a rare few hours off to attend a parent-teacher conference for Leo. However, a cancelled bus route meant she returned to the estate 2 hours early. The mansion was unusually quiet. Lorenzo had taken a crew to the south side to deal with a shipment issue, leaving only a skeleton crew of guards at the perimeter. Penny let herself in through the kitchen. As she walked toward the east wing, she heard a muffled, unnatural sound coming from Dominic's private medical room. She dropped her bag and hurried down the hall. Peeking through the crack in the door, her blood turned to ice. Dominic was slumped in his wheelchair, his arms pinned to the armrests by heavy leather straps, restraints usually used only when his muscle spasms became dangerously violent. Standing over him was Nurse Madeline, a seemingly sweet blonde woman hired through an elite private agency to handle Dominic's weekly blood work. Madeline wasn't drawing blood. She was holding a syringe filled with a clear liquid, pressing it toward Dominic's intravenous port. Dominic was conscious, his eyes wet and furious, but a gouge had been forced into his mouth, and a heavy, weighted blanket was thrown over his chest, severely restricting his breathing. Potassium chloride. The thought flashed in Penny's mind. Untraceable. It would look like a heart attack, a tragic complication of his paralysis. The rival, Victor Moretti, had finally gotten someone inside. Penny didn't think. She reacted. She burst through the door. "Hey!" she screamed. Madeline jumped, dropping the syringe. It clattered to the linoleum floor. The nurse quickly reached into her scrub pocket, pulling out a small, silenced pistol. Before Madeline could raise the weapon, Penny charged. She didn't have combat training. She didn't know martial arts, but she had 250 pounds of desperate, unyielding maternal rage. She threw her entire body weight forward, slamming into the nurse like a freight train. The impact knocked the breath out of Madeline. The gun skittered across the floor as both women crashed into a wall of medical supplies. Shelves collapsed, showering them in bandages and saline bags. Madeline was wiry and vicious, clawing at Penny's face, tearing a deep gash down her cheek. But Penny refused to let go. She grabbed the nurse by the collar of her scrubs, spun her around, and threw her weight down, pinning the assassin flat against the hard floor. Madeline thrashed wildly, screaming curses, but Penny straddled her, her sheer mass rendering the smaller woman completely immobilized. Penny reached up with a shaking, bloodied hand, grabbed a heavy metal IV pole, and slammed the base of it against the side of Madeline's head. The nurse went limp. Gasping for air, her heart threatening to explode out of her chest, Penny scrambled off the unconscious woman. She rushed to Dominic, her hands trembling as she tore the gag from his mouth and unbuckled the leather straps binding his arms. Dominic coughed violently, dragging in huge gulps of air. He looked down at the unconscious assassin, then up at Penny. Her face was bleeding heavily, her coat was torn, and she was shaking like a leaf, but she was standing firmly between him and the door, shielding his paralyzed body with her own. "Are you—" Penny panted, wiping blood from her eye. "Are you okay?" Dominic Castellano, a man who trusted no one, a man who had accepted his fate as a broken king waiting to be slaughtered, stared at the curvy, exhausted mother who had just saved his life. The ice in his eyes melted, replaced by a profound, burning intensity. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice thick with an emotion Penny had never heard from him before. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently touching her uninjured cheek. "You stayed. I told you," Penny breathed, leaning into his touch just a fraction. "I don't quit." The immediate aftermath of the assassination attempt was a masterclass in organized chaos. Lorenzo Bianchi returned to the Lakeshore Drive mansion 20 minutes later, his face draining of color when he saw the blood smeared across the pristine medical room floor. Madeline, the treacherous nurse, had been bound with the very leather straps she had intended for Dominic and dragged down into the soundproof basement. Penny sat on a velvet armchair in the corner of the master suite, an ice pack pressed against her bruised and macerated cheek, her hands still trembling with leftover adrenaline. Dominic Castellano refused to let the estate's private doctor tend to him until Penny was examined first. The paralyzing vulnerability he usually felt in his wheelchair was completely absent. It had been replaced by a smoldering, dangerous energy. He watched Penny with an unblinking, hawk-like intensity as the physician stitched the gash on her face. She did not cry, nor did she flinch. She simply stared straight ahead, her solid frame anchored in the room, like a lighthouse weathering a Category 5 hurricane. "You need to go home, Penelope," Lorenzo said gently, stepping into the room after finishing a phone call. "We will have a driver take you. We are going to lock the estate down. Victor Moretti's people have breached our vetting process. It isn't safe for you here anymore." "No." Dominic's voice was a low, guttural command that halted Lorenzo in his tracks. The Mafia Boss maneuvered his motorized wheelchair closer to Penny. "She isn't going back to Pilsen. Her apartment has a rusted deadbolt and a broken fire escape. If Moretti knows she thwarted the hit, she is a target. Lorenzo, send a crew to her apartment. Pack up everything that belongs to her and her son." Penny's head snapped up, the ice pack slipping from her cheek. "My son?" "Mr. Castellano, I appreciate the concern, but I am not bringing a 4-year-old boy into a mafia lockdown. He has a life, a preschool, a routine. His routine is now breathing and staying alive," Dominic countered, his icy blue eyes softening only fractionally as they met hers. "You saved my life, Penelope. In my world, a debt of blood is absolute. You threw yourself at an armed assassin for a paralyzed man who has done nothing but yell at you for 3 weeks. You are under my protection now, both of you. The East Wing is yours." Penny opened her mouth to argue, but the sheer exhaustion in her bones weighed her down. She looked at the heavy oak doors, the men with concealed weapons patrolling the halls, and then at Dominic. For all his ruthlessness, she knew he was right. If Victor Moretti was willing to poison a paralyzed man, he would not hesitate to silence the fat, struggling single mother who got in his way. By nightfall, Leo was running down the marble hallways of the Castellano estate, his light-up sneakers squeaking against the polished stone. He was entirely oblivious to the lethal nature of the men surrounding him. To Leo, Lorenzo was just the funny man with the cool scar, and the heavily armed guards were playmates who surprisingly knew how to play hide-and-seek. The turning point in the strange new dynamic occurred 3 days into the lockdown. Penny had stepped away to coordinate the delivery of fortified medical supplies when she heard a commotion in the Grand Library. Panic seized her throat. She sprinted toward the room, her heart pounding against her ribs, expecting the worst. Instead, she stopped dead in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. Dominic was positioned near the grand fireplace. Leo was sitting squarely on the footrest of Dominic's wheelchair, holding a heavily illustrated book about dinosaurs. The feared boss of the Chicago syndicate, a man who ordered executions before his morning espresso, was pointing at a Tyrannosaurus Rex with a steady, tattooed hand. "The T-Rex wasn't just strong, kid," Dominic was saying, his usually terrifying rumble of a voice modulated into a surprisingly gentle baritone. "He had to be smart. Everyone thinks it's just about having the biggest teeth. But if you don't watch your flanks, the smaller predators will tear you down. You understand?" "Like the raptors," Leo beamed, completely unafraid of the imposing man. "Exactly like the raptors," Dominic agreed, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. He looked up and saw Penny standing in the doorway. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of sudden vulnerability, as if he had been caught committing a crime. "He sneaked past the guards," Dominic muttered defensively, clearing his throat. "I see that," Penny said, walking into the room, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't felt in years. She placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "Leo, Mr. Castellano is a very busy man. We shouldn't bother him." "He's not bothering me," Dominic replied immediately. He looked at Penny, his gaze dropping to the healing stitches on her cheek, then tracing the soft, generous curves of her figure under her simple wool sweater. The air between them grew thick, charged with an unspoken tension that had been building since the day she refused to flinch at his shattered glass. "You look beautiful today, Penelope." Penny's cheeks flushed a deep crimson. She was used to being ignored, or worse, mocked. To hear the most powerful man in the city call her beautiful, and to see in his eyes that he meant it with every fiber of his being, was entirely disarming. But their quiet moment of connection was shattered by the frantic ringing of the estate's security alarm. Red strobe lights began flashing through the library windows, casting long, bloody shadows across the imported rugs. Lorenzo burst into the room, an assault rifle already gripped in his hands. "Boss, it's Moretti. He didn't send a strike team. He sent an army. They've breached the outer gate with a snowplow. We have maybe 3 minutes before they hit the front doors." Dominic's demeanor shifted instantly from a protective father figure to a ruthless general. "Take the boy to the panic room in the sub-basement. Penelope, go with him." "No," Penny stated firmly, picking Leo up and handing him to a bewildered Lorenzo. "Take Leo. Lock him in. Do not open that door for anyone but me." "Penelope, what are you doing?" Dominic roared as Lorenzo sprinted away with the terrified child. "Get out of here." "You need someone to manage the internal security feeds from the main terminal, and your chief of security just ran off with my son," Penny said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, icy competence. She walked over to the heavy oak desk and booted up the surveillance array. "I told you on day 1, Dominic. I don't quit." Gunfire erupted outside, a deafening cacophony of automatic weapons tearing through the freezing Chicago night. The heavy limestone walls of the estate absorbed most of the impact, but the sheer volume of bullets shattered the reinforced windows in the West Wing. Dominic rolled his chair beside the desk, pulling a customized high-capacity tactical rifle from a hidden compartment beneath his seat. His paralysis meant he couldn't take cover, but it also meant he was a fixed, immovable turret of lethal precision. "They are hitting the kitchen entrance," Penny reported, her eyes flying across the 12 glowing monitors on the desk. Her thick, capable fingers danced across the keyboard, locking down interior bulkheads and sealing the blast doors that separated the wings. 5 men, heavily armed. They have breaching charges. "Divert them," Dominic commanded, chambering around. "Open the corridor to the grand foyer. Create a funnel." Penny didn't hesitate. She executed the command, overriding the security protocols. As the blast doors shifted, she watched the monitors as Moretti's men poured into the trap. The moment they entered the grand foyer, Dominic's enforcers, positioned on the sweeping mahogany staircase, opened fire. The ambush was brutal and instantaneous. "Kitchen is clear," Penny said, her pulse roaring in her ears. She was sweating, her heart hammering, but her mind was fiercely lucid. "But we have a problem. 3 SUVs just crashed through the conservatory glass. Victor Moretti is with them." Dominic's jaw tightened. Victor Moretti was a snake, a lean, sociopathic killer who had capitalized on Dominic's injury to rally the dissenting factions of the underworld. "Where are they heading?" "They bypassed the stairs. They are heading straight for the library," Penny said, her breath hitching. "Dominic, they are coming for you. They know you are in here." "Good," Dominic said, a lethal calm washing over his features. "Let them come." The heavy mahogany doors of the library splintered inward as a localized explosive blew the hinges off. Smoke and dust choked the air, swirling in the red glare of the emergency lights. Out of the debris stepped Victor Moretti, flanked by 3 massive enforcers. Victor wore a bespoke charcoal suit, a smug, cruel smile twisting his thin lips as he leveled his weapon at the man in the wheelchair. "Look at you, Castellano," Victor sneered, stepping over the ruined doors. The great king of Chicago, reduced to a cripple sitting in the dark with his fat little secretary. Penny stood beside Dominic's chair, her fists clenched so tightly her nails bit into her palms. The insult stung, a reflexive phantom pain from a lifetime of cruel words, but she refused to cower. Dominic didn't look at Victor. He looked at Penny. "Cover your ears, Mia Regina." "My queen." Before Victor could react to the bizarre command, Dominic slammed his hand down on a small, hidden biometric scanner built into the armrest of his wheelchair. It wasn't just a panic button. It was a localized countermeasure system Dominic had installed during his long, agonizing months of recovery. The floorboards directly beneath Victor and his men suddenly dropped open, a hydraulic trap door originally designed as an emergency escape chute to the armored basement. But Dominic hadn't opened the chute completely. He had dropped the floor exactly 3 feet, sending Victor and his enforcers tumbling violently into a narrow, steel-lined trench. They crashed heavily, their weapons discharging wildly into the ceiling. Before they could scramble out of the sudden pit, Dominic rolled forward, positioning his wheelchair directly at the edge of the trench. He looked down at the sprawling, groaning men. His rifle was aimed squarely at Victor Moretti's chest. "You thought because my legs don't work. My mind was broken," Dominic said, his voice echoing like the tolling of a funeral bell. "You thought you could buy my nurses. You thought you could insult the woman who holds my empire together. You were wrong." Dominic pulled the trigger. A single, deafening shot ended the Moretti rebellion instantly. The remaining 3 enforcers in the trench immediately threw their weapons down, surrendering to the paralyzed king who had just outsmarted and outmaneuvered them in his own home. Silence descended upon the library, broken only by the distant wail of police sirens that Lorenzo had undoubtedly called in through the syndicate's compromised municipal contacts to clean up the mess. Dominic placed the rifle back in its holster. He let out a long, ragged exhale, the adrenaline slowly leaving his system. He turned his chair around to face Penny. She was standing amidst the smoke and ruined luxury of the library, her chest heaving. She looked at the blood, the broken wood, and the bodies. A normal woman would have fainted. A normal woman would have run screaming into the night. But Penelope Gallagher simply walked over to the heavy oak desk, picked up a clean microfiber cloth, and methodically began wiping the plaster dust off the surveillance monitors. Dominic watched her, utterly captivated. He propelled his chair forward until he was right beside her. He reached out, taking her hand, stopping her frantic cleaning. His thumb traced the soft, fleshy back of her hand, his touch infinitely gentle. "It's over," Dominic said softly. Penny looked down at him, a tear finally breaking free and tracking through the dust on her cheek. "Are you sure? Moretti is dead. The families will fall back in line. Lorenzo will clean this up," Dominic promised. He tugged her hand, pulling her closer until her knees were brushing the wheels of his chair. He looked up into her eyes, stripping away every ounce of his mafia bravado. "I told you the first day you wouldn't last 10 minutes. I have never been more glad to be wrong. You saved me, Penelope. Not just from Madeline, from the darkness, from giving up." Penny swallowed hard, looking at the fierce, beautiful, broken man before her. "I told you I don't quit." "Then don't," Dominic whispered, pulling her down. Penny leaned in, bridging the gap between them. When his lips met hers, it was a collision of fire and steel. Dominic kissed her with a desperate, all-consuming hunger, his large hands resting on her wide hips, pulling her solid warmth against his unmoving legs. It was a kiss that sealed a pact, not of employment, but of partnership. In that ruined library, amidst the ashes of a failed coup, the hierarchy of the Chicago underworld shifted forever. Penelope Gallagher was no longer the broke, invisible single mother struggling to pay rent. She was the immovable force beside the throne, the fiercely loyal, fiercely loved queen of the Castellano Empire. And together, they were completely, unequivocally untouchable. Penelope Gallagher didn't just survive the cutthroat world of the Castellano Syndicate. She redefined it. From a desperate mother, struggling to keep the lights on, to the powerhouse queen, ruling from the shadows of Lake Shore Drive, her journey proves that true strength isn't about being untouchable. It's about refusing to break. If you were captivated by this intense tale of loyalty and forbidden love, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that defy the odds.